The Promised Land of Greenwood, a true story of hope, ambition, and the birth of Black Wall Street. It began like a miracle born out of fire. At the turn of the 20th century, when America's promise of freedom still came wrapped in chains for many, a group of black men and women traveled south of Tulsa, Oklahoma, to build what the world said they could not. They came with nothing but faith, skill, and a fierce hunger to prove that their liberty meant more than just survival. What rose from those dusty plains was not just a neighborhood, it was a dream made real, a thriving all-black community so prosperous that it would soon be called the Promised Land of Greenwood. A vision born from struggle. In 1906, a visionary landowner named O.W. Gurley, a wealthy African-American entrepreneur from Arkansas, purchased 40 acres of land on the northern side of Tulsa. Gurley had one radical idea: to build a town where black people could live, work, and prosper, free from the daily humiliations of segregation. He opened a boarding house, a grocery store, and sold plots of land only to other black settlers. Soon, word spread through the South. Former slaves, teachers, barbers, doctors, and dreamers came to Tulsa by wagon, train, and foot, looking for opportunity and dignity. Greenwood became their sanctuary. They built homes, opened businesses, and sent their children to school. In a time when Jim Crow laws dictated where a black man could walk, Greenwood dared to rewrite the rules. By 1910, the district was alive with possibility. Tulsa newspapers began calling it Little Africa. Its residents had a different name: home. The rise of Black Wall Street. Within a decade, Greenwood grew into one of the most remarkable economic centers in the United States. It had over 600 thriving businesses, including 2 newspapers, 30 restaurants, 21 churches, a hospital, and a public library. There were theaters showing the latest films, tailors sewing fine suits, and jazz clubs where laughter and saxophones filled the Oklahoma night. Dr. A.C. Jackson, one of the nation's finest black surgeons, practiced medicine there. Gurley's Hotel welcomed traveling businessmen, while Stratford's Hotel, owned by J.B. Stratford, a lawyer and entrepreneur, was considered one of the most luxurious black-owned hotels in America. What made Greenwood so revolutionary wasn't just its wealth, it was its independence. Every dollar spent in Greenwood circulated nearly 90 times before leaving the community. At a time when much of America refused to serve black customers, Greenwood created its own banks, its own police, its own schools. It stood as living proof that black excellence could thrive, even in the shadow of hate. A symbol of hope. Across the country, newspapers and travelers spoke in awe of Tulsa's Black District. Visitors called it a Negro city within a city. For many African Americans fleeing racial violence in the South, Greenwood was more than a place. It was a symbol of what could be. Men wore tailored suits, women in silk dresses strolled down Greenwood Avenue, and children filled the schools with laughter and promise. The air buzzed with ambition. There was a sense of unity, an understanding that every success belonged to the community. It wasn't perfect. Segregation still loomed, and prejudice lingered outside Greenwood's borders. But within its boundaries, something rare had taken root: black pride without apology. For once, African Americans weren't merely surviving America's system. They were thriving despite it. The tensions beneath the surface. Yet, just as Greenwood's light grew brighter, shadows began to gather. Tulsa's white population, many of whom struggled economically after the oil boom slowed, watched Greenwood's success with a mix of fascination and resentment. To them, Greenwood was an impossible contradiction. How could black people, who were supposed to be inferior, build such wealth, such beauty, such power? Whispers began, cruel, dangerous whispers about arrogance, about competition, about putting people in their place. Still, life went on. Black Wall Street thrived under its own rhythm: jazz, laughter, prayer, and hard work. But history has a cruel way of punishing the proud. Seeds of a storm. On May 30th, 1921, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland entered an elevator in downtown Tulsa. Moments later, a young white elevator operator screamed. What exactly happened remains unclear. Most historians believe it was a simple accident, a stumble, a misunderstanding. But by evening, newspapers called it an assault. Headlines flamed racial fears. Crowds formed. Angry white residents demanded Rowland's lynching. Black World War I veterans, men who had fought for America's freedom abroad, rushed to the courthouse to protect him. That night, two worlds collided in a hail of bullets. By dawn, Tulsa's skyline was no longer a promise. It was smoke. Before the fire, the glory. But before the ashes, there was glory. Before the tragedy that history nearly buried, there was Greenwood in its golden age, the promised land that defied every barrier and built an empire of its own. It stood as the embodiment of black resilience and creativity, a blueprint for self-reliance that still inspires entrepreneurs and activists a century later. Greenwood was not born out of privilege or luck. It was forged from the courage of a people who believed that freedom wasn't something you waited for. It was something you built with your own hands. Legacy of the Promised Land. Today, as historians uncover the forgotten graves and the descendants of survivors rebuild Tulsa's Greenwood district, the spirit of that era lives again. Murals now color the same streets once painted in ash. Startups, museums, and memorials rise where banks and schools once stood. To walk through modern Greenwood is to feel both pride and pain. Pride in what once was, and pain for what was stolen. Yet through every echo of the past, one truth endures. You cannot burn a dream that has already taken root in the hearts of its people. The story of Black Wall Street isn't just a tragedy of destruction, it's a testament to rebirth. The promised land of Greenwood may have been scarred by hate, but it was never truly lost. Its legacy continues to whisper across America's conscience, reminding every generation that prosperity without equality is fragile, and that hope, once awakened, can never be erased.
The Golden Days of Prosperity, a true story from the heart of Black Wall Street. They called it the crown jewel of the black experience in America. Before the flames came, before the skies of Tulsa turned red with hate, Greenwood stood as a living dream, a place where ambition wore its finest suit and hope played jazz in the streets. It wasn't built by luck or charity, but by sweat, faith, and a stubborn refusal to remain small. Here, in the early 1900s, black men and women, many just one generation removed from slavery, built something America had never seen before. A city within a city, pulsing with wealth, culture, and pride. This was the golden age of Greenwood, a time when freedom had an address, and it was called Black Wall Street. The beating heart of Greenwood. If you had strolled down Greenwood Avenue in 1919, you might have thought you'd entered another world. Jazz floated from open windows. The scent of fresh bread and roasted peanuts drifted from bakeries and street vendors. Carriages lined the wide streets, and neatly dressed men tipped their hats as women in fine lace and silk walked by, arm in arm. The district glowed with prosperity. More than 10,000 black residents lived in Greenwood, and almost all of them were employed or owned a business. At a time when much of America treated African Americans as second-class citizens, here they were, doctors, bankers, lawyers, and landowners. The heart of Greenwood pulsed strongest at its center, deep Greenwood, where commerce and culture danced together. There, a sign above Gurley's hotel welcomed travelers. All are welcome here. And all truly were. A city built on determination. The foundations of Greenwood's success were laid by O.W. Gurley and J.B. Stratford, two men who dreamed bigger than the limits placed on them. Gurley's vision was clear: a black-owned district where money and opportunity would circulate freely within the community. Stratford, a lawyer and businessman, shared that vision, but took it further. He believed economic independence was the key to equality. He often told his peers, "We are not asking America to give us our rights, we are creating them." Together, their ideas transformed Greenwood into one of the richest black communities in the world. By 1920, Greenwood boasted two newspapers, the Tulsa Star and the Oklahoma Sun, both promoting racial pride and self-sufficiency. 30 restaurants serving everything from fried catfish to fine Southern cuisine. 21 churches echoing every Sunday with gospel and gratitude. 2 theaters, including the famous Dreamland Theater, which showed the latest films and hosted vaudeville acts. A hospital, a public library, and even a private bus service. In all, there were over 600 thriving businesses, all black-owned, all built from the ground up. The circulation of the black dollar. One of Greenwood's greatest achievements was its economic model. Every dollar earned in Greenwood stayed there, circulating up to 90 times before leaving the community. The tailor bought his supplies from the local merchant. The merchant banked at a black-owned bank. The banker dined at the local restaurant, whose owner hired local youth to wash dishes. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem of prosperity. In an age when racial segregation barred black Americans from most white establishments, Greenwood didn't beg for entry, it built its own doors. This economic resilience made Greenwood a symbol of possibility across the country. Journalists began calling it the Negro Wall Street of America. For the residents, that name wasn't just a compliment, it was validation that their dream was real. Life in the golden days. Greenwood was not merely a district, it was a heartbeat, a rhythm of resilience. Every morning, the barbershops filled with laughter and debate. Men gathered at Stratford's hotel to discuss business and politics over strong coffee. Children ran to school carrying new books, their parents' pride lighting every step. On Friday nights, the Dreamland Theater filled with jazz, blues, and laughter. Musicians like Count Basie and Ma Rainey passed through town, their melodies wrapping around the night air like a promise that the world was changing. The community's pride wasn't rooted only in wealth, it was in dignity. Greenwood's people were educated, cultured, and unafraid to dream. They built libraries to teach their children what the world wouldn't. They founded churches that doubled as community centers. And they raised each other up, knowing that every success was shared.
The women of Greenwood. Behind every storefront, there was often a woman holding it together. Women like Mabel B. Little, who owned one of Greenwood's finest beauty salons, and Lula Williams, who ran the Williams Confectionery, a cafe and candy shop that became a local landmark. They were business owners, mothers, teachers, and leaders. In a time when both race and gender worked against them, they carved out spaces of power. Greenwood's women proved that independence wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. Their efforts turned Greenwood into a place where a young black girl could look at the world and say, "One day I will own something too." The spirit of unity. What truly made Greenwood extraordinary was its sense of collective purpose. Neighbors looked out for one another. Churches pooled donations to help widows and new families. If someone fell ill, the community gathered funds to pay their hospital bills.
The Tulsa Star published stories of new business openings and student achievements. Its editor, A.J. Smitherman, used the newspaper to advocate for justice and civil rights, reminding readers that Greenwood's prosperity was not only economic, it was moral. In Greenwood, success wasn't measured by how much one had, but by how much one gave back. Beyond the borders. Greenwood's influence reached far beyond Tulsa. Visitors came from across the nation, from Chicago, St. Louis, and Atlanta, to see what was being called the miracle of the Midwest. African-American entrepreneurs studied Greenwood's business model, hoping to replicate its success. Civil rights leaders saw it as living proof that progress could bloom even in hostile soil. But for every admirer, there were also those who saw Greenwood as a threat. Jealousy grew among Tulsa's white residents. Rumors spread. The more Greenwood prospered, the louder the resentment became. Still, the people of Greenwood carried on, believing that their success was armor, that wealth and respectability would shield them from hate. They didn't yet know how wrong they were. Pride before the storm. By 1921, Greenwood had become an oasis of prosperity in a nation still poisoned by racism. Its residents celebrated not only financial success, but cultural identity. Parades filled the streets on Juneteenth, and black soldiers returning from World War I were greeted as heroes. From the outside, Greenwood looked untouchable, a shimmering example of what Black America could achieve when given the chance. But beneath the surface, Tulsa was a divided city. Across the railroad tracks that separated white Tulsa from black Tulsa, resentment festered. Many white citizens, struggling after the oil boom, looked upon Greenwood's success and saw not inspiration, but insult. To them, Black Wall Street was too proud, too independent, too alive. And in a nation still haunted by white supremacy, pride could be a dangerous thing. The last golden night. On the evening of May 30th, 1921, Greenwood shone as it always had. Jazz echoed from dreamland. The streets buzzed with conversation. Children played on porches, unaware that within 24 hours their world would burn. No one could have imagined that this night, filled with laughter and light, would be Greenwood's last as a paradise. But history is cruel to brilliance, and for all its success, Greenwood's greatest sin in the eyes of the world was simply that it had dared to exist. Legacy of the Golden Days. Though the flames of the Tulsa race massacre would soon turn this golden city to ash, the memory of its brilliance still endures. Greenwood's golden days remain a symbol of what Black America could achieve when freed from oppression, a living rebuke to every lie told about worth, intelligence, and ambition. Today, historians and descendants work to rebuild what was lost. Museums, memorials, and scholarships now stand where theaters and hotels once did. But more powerful than any building is the story, the reminder that once, in the heart of Oklahoma, a community of dreamers turned segregation into sovereignty. Their wealth was stolen, but their legacy became immortal. Because Greenwood was never just a place. It was, and still is, proof that freedom, once built, can never truly be destroyed.
A spark in the night, the true story of how one lie set Black Wall Street ablaze. It began with a scream, brief, sharp, and echoing through an elevator shaft. By morning, it would become the excuse for one of the deadliest racial massacres in American history. Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921. A city split by railroad tracks, by color, and by class. On one side stood Greenwood, the shining beacon of black prosperity known as Black Wall Street. On the other, white Tulsa, larger, poorer, and simmering with resentment. For years, the two worlds had existed side by side in fragile peace, divided by law and hatred, but held together by commerce and necessity. Then came the spark, the day the whisper began. On May 30th, 1921, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland entered the Drexel building in downtown Tulsa to use the elevator. Segregation laws meant this was one of the few buildings where black workers could use a restroom. Inside the elevator was a young white woman, Sarah Page, 17 years old, working as an elevator operator. What happened in the next few seconds remains one of history's most debated moments. Some said Rowland tripped and accidentally brushed against Page. Others claimed she screamed out of surprise, not fear. But when the elevator doors opened and a white clerk heard that scream, the story began to twist. By noon, rumors were running wild. By evening, the Tulsa Tribune, a local white-owned newspaper, published a front-page story with the headline, "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator." The article's language was inflammatory, describing Rowland as a Negro youth who assaulted a white woman. It was pure fiction, but in a city already burning with prejudice, fiction was enough to light a match. The making of a mob. By sunset, crowds of angry white citizens began to gather outside the Tulsa County Courthouse, demanding that Dick Rowland be handed over for justice. The word they really meant was lynching. Lynching was no stranger to Oklahoma. In the early 1900s, it was the dark ritual of the South, public, brutal, and often photographed. Just 2 years earlier, a black man in Oklahoma City had been hanged without trial. The law rarely intervened. But this time, Greenwood would not stand by and watch another innocent man die. When word reached the black community that a mob was forming, dozens of armed black World War I veterans, men who had fought for America overseas but were denied basic rights at home, decided to act. They marched to the courthouse, rifles in hand, determined to protect Rowland. Witnesses later said the veterans were calm and disciplined, led by A.J. Smitherman, editor of the Tulsa Star, and other community leaders. They offered their help to the sheriff, who refused, insisting that the situation was under control. The veterans turned to leave. The crowd jeered. Then, someone reached for a gun. The first shot. The details are murky, but witnesses agree that a white man tried to disarm one of the black veterans. The gun went off. A single gunshot cracked through the night air like lightning. That was the spark. Panic erupted instantly. Within seconds, both sides exchanged fire. Dozens were killed or wounded in the chaos. The veterans retreated towards Greenwood, pursued by an enraged white mob that grew by the hour. By midnight, Tulsa was no longer a city divided by tracks, it was a battlefield. Fear turns to fury. White Tulsa exploded with violence. Word spread that Negroes are rising up, and hundreds of armed white men, many deputized by local police, took to the streets. Some were issued weapons and told to get a gun and get a Negro. Groups looted pawn shops and hardware stores for ammunition. They set up roadblocks, shot at passing cars, and dragged black men from vehicles. From the rooftops of Greenwood, veterans tried to defend their neighborhood. They fired back to protect their homes and families, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. One survivor later recalled, "They came from every direction, like a storm you couldn't stop." By dawn, on June 1st, 1921, Tulsa was no longer a city divided by tracks, it was a battlefield. The sky catches fire. As the sun rose, a strange roar filled the air, the sound of airplanes. White vigilantes had taken to the skies, dropping homemade explosives and firing rifles into the streets below. Eyewitnesses reported seeing gasoline-filled bottles hurled onto rooftops, igniting homes and businesses. The sky over Greenwood turned black with smoke and flame. On the ground, white mobs set fire to everything in sight: homes, churches, schools, hospitals. Families fled into the woods or the Arkansas River, trying to escape the inferno. The Dreamland Theater, Stratford's Hotel, Gurley's store, all reduced to ash. The same streets that once rang with jazz and laughter now echoed with gunfire and screams. The attack was systematic. Firefighters who tried to respond were turned away at gunpoint. The National Guard arrived only after the destruction was complete. By noon, Greenwood, once a symbol of black excellence and independence, lay in ruins. The arrest of the innocent. When the smoke cleared, the scale of devastation defied belief. 35 city blocks had been burned. Over 1,200 homes and businesses were destroyed. Historians estimate that as many as 300 people were killed, though the official count was far lower. And the survivors? They were marched at gunpoint to internment camps, held for days, sometimes weeks, while their homes smoldered in the distance. Among those arrested was J.B. Stratford, one of Greenwood's wealthiest men. He was accused of inciting a riot simply because he had tried to defend his community. His hotel, valued at over $75,000, millions in today's money, was gone. O.W. Gurley's store was leveled. Churches that had stood for decades were flattened. And yet in the middle of it all, Dick Rowland, the young man whose supposed crime started it all, was quietly released from custody. No charges, no trial. Because Sarah Page, the woman he was accused of assaulting, refused to press charges. The lie had done its damage. The silence that followed. In the weeks that followed, Tulsa's white newspapers buried the story. City officials called the massacre a riot, framing it as mutual violence rather than a one-sided attack. Insurance companies refused to pay damages, citing riot clauses. Survivors were left to rebuild with nothing but ashes and memories. Some left Tulsa forever, unable to face the wreckage. Others stayed, determined to rise again. Because Greenwood, even in ruin, was more than a collection of buildings. It was an idea. But for decades, the story was buried. Schools didn't teach it, newspapers didn't print it. Even among families, silence replaced conversation. It wasn't until the late 20th century, nearly 80 years later, that America began to confront what truly happened in Tulsa. Lessons from the fire. Looking back, historians now understand that the Tulsa race massacre was never about one elevator or one scream. It was about fear, fear of black success, fear of equality, fear that the illusion of white superiority was cracking. Greenwood's prosperity had challenged the racist hierarchy of its time, and for that, it was destroyed. But even amid tragedy, the spirit of Greenwood endured. Survivors rebuilt their businesses brick by brick. Churches reopened. Children went back to school. The flames could not erase the pride that had built Black Wall Street in the first place. Today, Tulsa's rebuilt Greenwood district stands as both a memorial and a rebuke, proof that truth cannot stay buried forever. The spark that still burns. Over a century later, the story of Dick Rowland and Sarah Page remains a haunting reminder of how fragile peace can be when injustice goes unchecked. One rumor, one spark can destroy a community, but it can also ignite something else, a demand for remembrance, for justice, and for change. The night Tulsa burned was not just the destruction of a neighborhood. It was the attempt to erase a triumph, to silence a people who dared to dream too loudly. Yet even in the ashes, the same fire that built Greenwood still glows.
The world finally listens now to the whispers of the past, to the truth long hidden beneath the smoke. And from those whispers, a new promise rises, that the next spark, when it comes, will not destroy, but illuminate.
The night the sky turned red. The true story of the night Black Wall Street burned. The night began with silence and ended with screams. It was June 1, 1921, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the city's finest black community, the pride of America's black prosperity, was about to vanish in fire. The streets of Greenwood, once glowing with laughter, jazz, and the hum of ambition, now flickered under the light of torches. Smoke curled above rooftops. Somewhere in the distance, the low hum of engines rumbled, airplanes circling like vultures. When the first bomb fell, the sky turned red. This was not a war between nations. It was a war waged against American citizens by their own neighbors. The morning before the inferno. Just hours before sunrise, Greenwood still breathed, wounded from the chaos of the night before, but alive. Families huddled in their homes, praying the violence would fade with dawn. Some clutched what little they could carry, a Bible, a photograph, a child's hand. But outside, the mob was gathering. Across the railroad tracks in white Tulsa, armed men prepared for what they called a Negro uprising. Their goal was not justice, it was destruction. Police officers, deputized civilians, and ordinary citizens loaded rifles, gasoline, and explosives. At the Tulsa Armory, weapons were handed out freely. Witnesses later said one police officer shouted, "Get a gun and get a Negro." Meanwhile, inside Greenwood, World War I veterans, men who'd once fought for freedom in France, tried to defend their families. They dug trenches, took up positions behind windows, and waited. But they were vastly outnumbered. By sunrise, over 2,000 armed white men surrounded Greenwood. Fire in the air. At 5 a.m., the assault began. Gunfire ripped through the streets. White mobs stormed into Greenwood from every direction, firing into homes and businesses. Then the sound that no one expected. Engines overhead. Eyewitnesses reported seeing small airplanes circling low above the rooftops. Some dropped turpentine-soaked rags and incendiary bombs. Others fired rifles from the sky. The roar of the engines drowned out the screams below. The air grew thick with smoke and ash. Flames leapt from building to building, devouring everything in their path. A survivor, Eddie Faye Gates, would later recall, "The sky was red. It wasn't dawn. It was fire. It was like the end of the world." Greenwood burned. By mid-morning, Greenwood was unrecognizable. The Dreamland Theater, once filled with jazz and laughter, collapsed in flames. Stratford's Hotel, a symbol of black success, was torched to the ground. Dr. A.C. Jackson's medical office, where one of America's best black surgeons saved lives, was destroyed. Jackson himself was shot and killed while surrendering to police. Churches burned, schools burned, the homes of teachers, barbers, preachers, and nurses, all gone. Firefighters who tried to help were blocked at gunpoint. Mobs shouted, "Let it burn!" Entire families fled toward the river, chased by gunfire. Mothers wrapped babies in blankets and ran barefoot through fields. Elderly men were beaten or shot in the streets. Some hid in basements as flames rolled above them. Others escaped through cornfields, guided only by the orange glow of their burning city. By noon, the smoke could be seen for miles. The arrest of the survivors. When the National Guard finally arrived, it was too late. Greenwood was already ashes. But instead of helping the victims, the Guard began rounding up black survivors. Armed soldiers marched them through the streets at gunpoint, men, women, and children. They were herded into makeshift internment camps at the convention hall, the fairgrounds, and McNulty Park. Those who resisted were shot. Those who begged for help were ignored. Photographs from that day show thousands of terrified black residents lined up under armed guard, their faces hollow with disbelief. Behind them, the city still burned. Meanwhile, looters rummaged through the ruins, stealing jewelry, furniture, and clothing from the homes of those they'd just displaced. One white witness later admitted, "It wasn't a riot, it was a massacre. They came to destroy, not to fight."
The City of Ashes. When the smoke finally lifted, 35 city blocks lay in ruin. Over 1,200 homes and businesses were destroyed. 21 churches, 30 restaurants, 2 newspapers, 1 hospital, and every school in the district. Gone. Greenwood, once called the Negro Wall Street of America, had been wiped from the map in less than 24 hours. The Red Cross arrived days later to aid the wounded and homeless. Its director described Tulsa as a city of ashes. The official death toll claimed 36 lives, but survivors and historians knew better. Bodies were dumped in the Arkansas River, loaded into trucks, or buried in unmarked mass graves. Modern researchers estimate as many as 300 people were killed, making it one of the deadliest acts of racial violence in U.S. history. The lies and the silence. In the massacre's aftermath, the white press called it a riot. City officials claimed black residents had instigated the violence. Insurance companies denied all claims, labeling the destruction as riot damage. Over $27 million in property losses, in today's value, over $200 million, were never compensated. No white person was ever charged. No one was punished. And for decades, the story disappeared from public memory. Schools didn't teach it. Newspapers didn't print it. Survivors were told to stay silent or risk their lives again. It was as if Greenwood had never existed. The survivors. But memory has a way of surviving, even in ashes. Elderly survivors, those who had lost everything, began rebuilding almost immediately. They pitched tents on the charred remains of their homes. Churches held services in open fields. Families cooked meals over makeshift stoves, refusing to give up. Within months, some businesses reopened: barbershops, cafes, small stores. By the mid-1920s, despite laws designed to block them, Black Tulsans rebuilt large portions of Greenwood with their own hands. They rebuilt without loans, without insurance, without apology. Their courage became the quiet revenge. The hidden graves. Even as Greenwood rose again, the truth remained buried, literally. For decades, rumors persisted about mass graves hidden under Tulsa soil. It wasn't until the 21st century that archaeologists began to uncover evidence of these graves. In 2020, nearly a century later, the city finally acknowledged what survivors had long known. Hundreds had been murdered and buried in secret. The discovery reignited a national reckoning. Historians called it one of America's darkest, most deliberately erased chapters. A city confronts its past. Today, Tulsa stands divided between the ghosts of its history and the determination to heal. The Greenwood Rising Museum, opened in 2021, tells the story that once was forbidden. Murals now cover the walls of rebuilt Greenwood, each one honoring the lost. Descendants of survivors continue to fight for reparations and recognition. The search for mass graves continues. The memory of that night, of the sky turning red, burns still, not in hatred, but in remembrance. For many, Greenwood represents not just tragedy, but testimony, proof of what Black Americans built and what they endured. The night that the sky turned red. When the sun set on June 1, 1921, Tulsa was no longer the same city. Greenwood, that miracle of self-made success, was gone, but its spirit refused to die. The massacre exposed the truth America had tried to ignore, that even in the land of freedom, progress could be punished and prosperity could be feared. Yet from the ashes of Greenwood came a lesson that resilience burns hotter than hate. Every brick laid in Greenwood, every shop rebuilt afterward, carried a defiance that no mob could erase. And so when we speak of the night the sky turned red, we speak not only of fire and death, but of the courage of those who lived to tell it, and of the generations who now carry their light forward, because history does not truly die when it is remembered. And Greenwood, though burned to the ground, still shines as a warning, a wound, and a flame that refuses to go out.
Silence, shadows, and survival. The forgotten aftermath of the Tulsa Race Massacre. The smoke had cleared, but the silence that followed was heavier than the ash that blanketed Tulsa. In the early summer of 1921, the streets of Greenwood, once alive with jazz, laughter, and prosperity, now lay in ruins. Charred bricks marked where dreams once stood. Families wandered through rubble, searching for photographs, for names, for proof that they had once lived there. But what came after the fire was not healing, it was erasure. The silence after the fire. The survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre did not just lose their homes and businesses, they lost their voice. In the days following the destruction, the city declared martial law, rounding up thousands of Black residents into internment camps. Men who had fought in World War I were forced to raise their hands in surrender. Women and children were made to march through the streets under armed guard. When they were finally released, they returned to find nothing. Their homes, ashes, their shops, looted, their churches gone. And when they sought justice, they were met with locked doors. Insurance companies rejected every claim, citing a riot clause. The city refused to rebuild or compensate, and White Tulsa told the survivors one simple message: forget it ever happened. Reporters who tried to document the massacre were silenced. Newspapers that had once printed headlines of chaos quietly removed the stories from their archives. Within a year, official records of the massacre were nearly gone, as if Greenwood had vanished overnight. The shadows of memory. But memory cannot be buried forever. In the years that followed, survivors carried the truth like a secret flame, whispered from parent to child, guarded in prayer. Mary E. Jones Parrish, a journalist and survivor, became one of the first to write down what she saw. Her 1923 book, Events of the Tulsa Disaster, recorded eyewitness accounts when no one else dared to. She wrote, "They tried to silence us, but I knew someone had to remember." Still, most survivors said nothing. Speaking of the massacre could cost you your job or your life.
So they rebuilt quietly, brick by brick, with trembling hands and unbroken hearts. Some families rebuilt their homes right on the same lots, using whatever scrap wood or metal they could find. Others lived in tents for months, enduring rain and winter frost. And yet by 1925, parts of Greenwood rose again. New restaurants opened. Churches were rebuilt. The laughter of children returned, softer now, but still defiant. It was a miracle born from endurance, a community resurrected from its own ashes. America turns the page. While Greenwood fought to survive, America moved on. Textbooks did not mention the massacre. History teachers skipped over it. Politicians never spoke of it. For decades, the event was known only by a handful of scholars and families. In the wider narrative of American progress, the massacre simply did not exist. Even the survivors' descendants grew up in confusion, knowing something terrible had happened, but never hearing the full truth. A survivor named Viola Fletcher, who was just 7 years old in 1921, recalled in an interview nearly a century later, "I still see black men being shot, bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke, but for 70 years no one asked me about it." The silence was not ignorance, it was deliberate. Shadows beneath the ground. Underneath Tulsa's soil, however, the truth waited. For years, rumors spread about mass graves, of trucks carrying bodies away under cover of night, of pits dug behind churches and cemeteries. Survivors spoke of seeing corpses thrown into the Arkansas River or buried near the city's edge. But no one investigated. No one wanted to. It wasn't until the late 1990s, after relentless pressure from historians and descendants, that Oklahoma finally formed a commission to study what had really happened in Greenwood. What they uncovered shattered the official story. Documents revealed how city officials and law enforcement had helped arm white mobs. Witnesses confirmed that airplanes were used in the attack, a horrifying first in American history. And financial records showed the true scale of loss. Over $27 million, today more than $200 million. For the descendants of Greenwood, justice was still out of reach.
The survivors who refused to die. Yet, in the silence, Greenwood lived on. Through its people, survivors became teachers, preachers, doctors, and mentors. They taught their children the same lesson that had sustained them. Quote, "They can burn our buildings, but not our spirit." End quote. J.B. Stratford, once the owner of the Grand Stratford Hotel, one of the largest black-owned hotels in America, fled Tulsa during the massacre to avoid lynching. Decades later, his descendants fought to clear his name, proving that he had been wrongfully accused of inciting a riot. O.W. Gurley, the man who first envisioned Greenwood, moved quietly to Los Angeles and continued his work helping black communities thrive. His dream had been attacked, but not extinguished. And those who stayed in Tulsa built a new Greenwood, smaller but alive. Jazz clubs reopened. Beauty salons flourished. Churches filled once more with hymns of hope. By the 1940s and 50s, Greenwood had once again become a symbol of black enterprise, though its scars were never far beneath the surface. The price of silence. But the silence came at a cost. Generations grew up without knowing their history. Wealth that could have been passed down vanished in smoke. Families who once owned thriving businesses died in poverty.
The massacre didn't just destroy a neighborhood, it erased the foundation of generational black wealth in America. Economists estimate that the destruction of Greenwood robbed black families of hundreds of millions in potential assets and investments over the century that followed. It wasn't just fire that consumed Greenwood, it was opportunity. Breaking the silence. Then, nearly 100 years later, the silence finally cracked. In 2020, a new generation of journalists, historians, and activists began to unearth the truth with renewed urgency. Excavations began in Oaklawn Cemetery, where radar detected anomalies consistent with mass graves. Television cameras returned to Tulsa, not to sensationalize, but to listen. Survivors like Viola Fletcher, Hughes Van Ellis, and Leslie Benningfield Randall testified before Congress, demanding recognition and reparations. At 107 years old, Fletcher stood before lawmakers and said, quote, "I am here seeking justice for a lifetime of being ignored. We lost everything that day, our homes, our churches, our dreams, and never got anything back." End quote. Her words rippled through the nation, echoing through generations of silence. In 2020, the Greenwood Rising History Center opened, a monument not to tragedy, but to truth. Visitors now walk through immersive exhibits that tell the story of what happened, what was lost, and what still survives. For the first time in a century, Tulsa began to speak. The strength of remembering. The story of Greenwood isn't just about destruction, it's about defiance. The massacre tried to erase a people, but the survivors wrote their legacy in resilience. They built again when no one helped them. They remembered when no one listened, and they told their children, even in whispers, never forget. Today, that whisper has become a chorus. Across the United States, historians, educators, and communities are teaching the Tulsa story, not as a footnote, but as a cornerstone of understanding America's racial past. Because silence, left unchallenged, breeds repetition. But truth, once spoken, heals. From shadows to light. A century later, Greenwood stands again, smaller, quieter, but alive. Murals now line the streets, painted with faces of those who once walked there. The old Dreamland Theater has become a cultural center. Jazz still plays on Greenwood Avenue, where the ghosts of the past seem to sway with the music. The survivors may be gone, but their stories live, not in whispers now, but in voices that rise proudly, echoing across time. For decades, the world tried to forget them, but Greenwood never forgot itself. And that, more than wealth, more than revenge, is the true victory of survival.
Resurrection of a dream. How the spirit of Black Wall Street lives on a century later. The past never truly dies. It waits, buried beneath the soil, whispering through generations until someone finally listens. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, those whispers have become voices. A century after the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, the streets once drowned in fire now echo with a new kind of sound. Footsteps of a generation rebuilding not just what was lost, but what was denied. The ashes of Greenwood were meant to silence a people. Instead, they became the soil for a rebirth. The ghosts beneath the pavement. If you walk down Greenwood Avenue today, you'll see sleek coffee shops, tech incubators, and memorials etched with names once erased from history. But beneath those sidewalks lie the bones of a dream, a reminder that these streets once burned under the red sky of hate.
In June 1921, Tulsa, known as Black Wall Street, was one of the most prosperous black communities in America until mobs destroyed it overnight. For nearly a century, silence buried the truth. Survivors whispered their stories behind closed doors. Their children grew up in the shadow of loss, and America looked away. But now, the ground itself is speaking again. In recent years, archaeologists have unearthed mass graves, proof of what many had long denied. Each discovery doesn't just rewrite Tulsa's history, it reclaims it. As Reverend Robert Turner said during a 2020 memorial service, "We are not digging for bones, we are digging for justice." The ghosts of Greenwood are no longer hidden. They have become guides, urging a new generation to finish what their ancestors began. The second rebirth. In 2021, on the centennial of the massacre, Tulsa stood at a crossroads. Would it continue to hide its past or finally confront it? That year marked the opening of the Greenwood Rising History Center, a stunning museum built at the very entrance of the district once reduced to ashes. Inside, visitors walk through a timeline that begins with the brilliance of Black Wall Street, barbershops, banks, hotels, and theaters, and ends with hope, not despair. Interactive exhibits invite visitors to feel the story, to stand in a recreation of the Dreamland Theater, to hear the distant hum of airplanes, to see the streets burned, and then to see them rebuilt. Outside the museum, murals bloom on walls like living testaments. Names like O.W. Gurley, J.B. Stratford, and Dr. A.C. Jackson now stand tall again, honored not as victims, but as visionaries. This new Greenwood does not erase the old one. It stands on top of it, carrying its memory forward. The descendants rise. For the descendants of Greenwood's original residents, the rebirth is both personal and political. Gregory Brown, great-grandson of a Dreamland theater manager, now runs a local foundation helping black entrepreneurs open businesses in the district. He says, "My grandfather saw everything taken from him. So every time a new black business opens on Greenwood, I feel like we've won something back." Dozens of startups have launched from black-owned incubators in Tulsa, focusing on finance, tech, and creative arts. The Black Wall Street Chamber of Commerce, founded in 2018, now supports hundreds of entrepreneurs in reclaiming the district's legacy of self-sufficiency. Even the new generation of artists, poets, and filmmakers carry the torch. Tulsa-born rapper Steph Simon created the Fire in Little Africa album, a musical tribute blending hip-hop with the spirit of Greenwood. He said, "Our ancestors built something incredible. Now it's our turn to make sure their dream keeps living." Every lyric, every small business, every mural is an act of resurrection. But the fight for justice remains unfinished. In 2021, 3 of the last known massacre survivors, Viola Fletcher, Hughes Van Ellis, and Leslie Benningfield Randall, testified before Congress demanding reparations. Fletcher, then 107 years old, told lawmakers, "I still hear the screams. I still see the fire. I lost my home, my church, my community, and no one ever paid for it." Their testimonies electrified the nation. It was a living bridge between history and now, proof that the massacre was not ancient history, but living trauma. In the years since, lawsuits have been filed demanding restitution for lost property and generational wealth. Though courts have repeatedly dismissed them, public pressure continues to build. Activists argue the reparations are not about money alone, but acknowledgement, a moral debt America still owes. Even President Joe Biden, visiting Tulsa on the massacres' 100th anniversary, called it an act of hate and domestic terrorism. For the first time in U.S. history, a sitting president recognized the full horror of what happened. The silence had finally broken, officially.
Reclaiming the dream. The new Greenwood is not about nostalgia. It is about reclaiming the future that was stolen. On North Greenwood Avenue, young entrepreneurs now walk where burned-out businesses once stood. Coffee shops bear names like Black Wall Street Liquid Lounge. Bookstores stock titles by Black authors banned in nearby schools. At night, the street comes alive again with jazz, hip-hop, and conversation, the same rhythm that pulsed through Greenwood a century ago. Educational programs like Greenwood Leadership Academy teach students not just math and science, but history, the real history their grandparents were never taught. In downtown Tulsa, tech companies like Build in Tulsa are providing funding and mentorship to help close the racial wealth gap, aiming to make Tulsa once again a center for Black innovation. This is more than restoration, it's reinvention. Greenwood's rebirth is not a return to the past, it's the continuation of an interrupted dream. From Tulsa to the nation. The spirit of Black Wall Street has spread far beyond Oklahoma. Across America, Black entrepreneurs and communities are invoking Greenwood's legacy as a symbol of empowerment. In cities like Atlanta, Detroit, and Houston, Black Wall Street projects are emerging. Incubators, cultural hubs, and digital platforms built in the same spirit of unity and economic independence. In the digital world, new generations are creating virtual Greenwood spaces, online communities connecting Black creators and investors. Social movements like #BuyBlack and #BuildBlackWallStreet have drawn millions of participants. What began as a single neighborhood now stands as a global movement. The fire that once destroyed Greenwood has become a metaphor for something unstoppable, the flame of self-determination. Remembering to rebuild. Every May, Tulsa gathers to remember. The Tulsa Race Massacre commemoration is not a funeral, it's a promise. Descendants, historians, and visitors walk together through the streets, laying flowers, lighting candles, and telling stories once forbidden. At the memorial wall, etched in stone, are the names of those who died and the words, "We rise again." The same streets where mobs once marched are now filled with school children, learning that their ancestors were builders, not victims. And as the sun sets over Greenwood, it bathes the murals in gold, a color once symbolic of wealth, now symbolic of endurance. The legacy lives on. 100 years ago, Greenwood was a dream, of freedom, wealth, and dignity. It was burned to the ground, forgotten by many, but not by those who carried it in their blood. Today, that dream has risen once more, not in the same form, but in spirit, in vision, in courage. Because resurrection isn't about restoring what was lost. It's about proving that what was built from hope can never truly die. The people of Greenwood turned their pain into purpose, their silence into song, their shadows into strength. They rebuilt not just a neighborhood, but a legacy. And now, as America begins to face its past, Greenwood stands as both a mirror and a beacon, reflecting what was broken and showing what can still be made whole. The dream that burned 100 years ago now burns again, brighter than ever.